This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today's guest has 3 master's degrees, 2 in philosophy with a focus on artificial intelligence and consciousness, and another master's in integrated media communications, 2 from University of Nebraska-Lincoln and 1 from University of Glasgow. For the past 10 years, she's worked in analytics across a variety of industries, working for companies such as Bloomberg, Gartner, and Wunderman. She also teaches as an adjunct professor. She was at University of Nebraska-Lincoln and now is over at UNC Chapel Hill. Please welcome Director of Business Analytics at Beacon Building Products, Stephanie Shipp. Welcome to the show, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I am super excited to have you. Thanks for coming on. What is one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
So I think the big thing that I've seen is you can use data to inform larger business decisions, but it's kind of a balance between speed, insights, and accuracy. So obviously you want the data to be accurate, but a lot of times you see people get caught up on, kind of the minutia. So like very, kind of important details, but things that may not drive the business at the end of the day. And so I think it's prioritizing that balance of what you're going to get out of the analysis that you provide and the level of effort that you're putting in.
This is one of those things that I think everybody, when it's presented this way and we're like, okay, well, there's a trade-off between speed and accuracy. Everyone's like, yes, of course. Right. And then I say, okay, well, do you want it really fast? And they're like, oh, absolutely, the fastest. And it's like, okay, so like what degree of inaccuracy are you willing to tolerate in order to increase the speed? And they're like 0% inaccuracy. It's like, okay, wait, so, and there, by the way, we want it to cost nothing too.
Yeah.
So how do we practically transition this idea, which everybody seems to know is true on the surface level, into the real world of actually like stomaching something being inaccurate? Or stomaching something taking longer than you want it to because you want it to be super accurate, or stomaching that something costs money. How do we help people get this?
So the simple answer would be level setting, but that generally doesn't work because everyone wants everything to be perfect. So you can say, we do this a lot with our stakeholders, and the companies I've worked for, this has been true almost every single time. One organization in particular that I worked for, I think had a really healthy balance, but it was very much an analytically focused organization. And so I think that expectation was already baked in. I think what we've seen work best, especially in environments where, you have a more mature, or a less mature analytics, program, is providing some sort of accuracy score or, some sort of expectation. So right now we have a machine learning model that we're working on, and, the expectation is that some results will be better than others, just the nature of what the model is. So what we're doing is reining it back in and attaching an accuracy score to it. So at least expectations are set, and there's just, kind of those caveats within the environment in which people are engaging with the data. And so I think that goes to, a lot of what we're doing, a lot of machine learning models and things like that. You can attach, an accuracy score to that and be pretty set, but it gets harder when it's, Excel data pulls or, like PowerPoints that you're presenting. And so I think it depends as well. And this is, trying to change culture. Something that we've been working through is, talking to our stakeholders and trying to educate them about the fact that, if it's going to a senior level executive, it probably needs to be pretty accurate, but depends on the, dollar amount of the attached decision. So if it's, a, $50 million decision, it needs to be pretty accurate. But if it's something that's, probably, a few grand or 20K or, something like that, then it's speed that you want. So we're trying to work internally and educate our stakeholders. I think a lot of it is, getting these cohorts and groups that we have analytics touch bases with all of our primary stakeholders, and making sure they kind of see our process and that we can educate as we go, and they feel part of the decisions and understand what the trade-offs are.
Yeah. I've touched on it a few times here. There was a conversation, like a podcast that Jeff Bezos did, where, and I'm sure this, like, maybe this was his idea. I don't know if it came from someone before him, but like I was introduced to the idea there, where he talks a lot about how categorizing every decision into like, what is this, a one-way decision or a two-way decision? Meaning, like, are the costs very, very high for changing your mind down the road or not? Is really, really critical. Because, for example, right, like if the cost of being wrong
Mhm.
in a decision is $50 million, but it would take us like 2 years of staying on the wrong track to realize that cost. And we're going to know within 2 weeks whether the decision was wrong, and we can kind of like just bang, try it. And then it's kind of like, all right, well, then I don't know why we would spend any more than, 2 weeks on trying to make a decision, right? Just like shoot your shot and see how it goes. So when you work with other organizations, how do you see their ability to understand whether something is
Mhm.
a one-way decision or a two-way decision? Because I would argue that that's kind of an analytics question in and of itself. I
Mhm.
talk to a lot of people, especially, entrepreneurs and mid-sized business leaders that, I ask them the question like, okay, what's the cost of being wrong here? And they're like, I
Yeah.
don't know. So how do we get better at that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we try to do before we talk to our stakeholders, and I think this rings true for any analysis or any deliverable we provide, is to, really come forward with recommendations. So come forward
Mm,
with what we think the risk is. We luckily sit in finance. In other organizations I've been in, we've been in product. It's very nice to sit in finance and have that capability to come forward and say, this is what we think the risk is. So if it's going to our executive team, obviously, we don't want to be wrong because they're making, kind of, very large decisions that can impact the organization. And the cost of being wrong there is a lot higher than, other scenarios. But that being said, I think, we do strive to be as accurate as possible. You can get into the details on these things in terms of, we want this filter, we want that filter. It can really get into the details. Obviously, it needs to be pretty accurate. But that being said, I think, when we go to our stakeholders, and, this has been true in, most of the organization that I've worked with, when you go to your stakeholders, no matter what analysis or what deliverable you're providing, you have your risks that you see because they'll see different risks. And this is kind of what we're talking about actually this week in the course I teach is, what having those stakeholders in the room that are aware of the different risks because they'll see risks that you don't see. So even from an analytics perspective, we may see, and depending on what organization you sit in, if you sit in product, if you sit in finance, you'll see the risks that you would within the department you're in and within the role you're in. But then your stakeholders will be aware of other risks that may exist. So for instance, if you're working with a call center, they may see, customer complaints coming through that you're unaware of. And so we go understanding we also have blind spots. We go and, state whatever risks we think are possible. For example, we provided a model, and not to get into details because it's proprietary, but basically there's a lot of things that could have, posed risk within the model. In terms of the methodology, it's just making sure everyone's aligned on the methodology. It's consistent. It's something that's very qualitative, very hard to measure. But being able to come to the table and say, just up front, here are your risks. Here's why we think this is the best approach. And in terms of the cost, this was, other than manpower free to do, publicly available data. You can come and say, these are the things we're aware of now, dear team that you're working with, whoever that stakeholder is. what risks do you see? And do we think that this
Mhm.
is a good way to proceed forward?
Yeah, I really like the idea that you're driving at here. We had another guest on recently, Mark Brady, that talked about this idea. So he wrote a book actually on this and a handful of other topics, but this was contained within his book, where he talks about how there are kind of four levels of understanding data, and he
Mhm,
he delineates the difference between understanding your data and understanding your data in the context of other data.
mhm.
So this is kind of like the difference to me of, hey, person that asked me a question, here's our revenue for the last 6 months. Okay, cool. That can be helpful. That can be useful for answering certain questions. But then we start saying, well, how is our, business performance over those months? Do we know, were there any like anomalies and things that happened? Did we have like a distribution center go down? Like,
Yeah.
taking other pieces of information, or as we were just talking about, saying, hey, okay, well, here's the information for this decision, but let me help contextualize this. This is a one-way decision. The operational cost of like switching your CRM platform and then not liking it and having to switch your CRM platform again, this would be astronomically wasteful and expensive.
Mhm.
So we need to be really right here. And so we want to take a little bit longer time, and like contextualizing around the decision, I think, is one of the things that people like us are most uniquely suited to do. And like you said, I also um started my analytics journey in financial analytics, and I do think that we're well situated. Like, people look to that type of analyst for that type of information. Like, hey, how much is this going to cost?
Yeah.
So you do get to have some of those conversations. I want to I want to change tack if I can.
Yeah.
Talk to me about the AI consciousness work that you did.
Yeah, so as part of my 3 MAs, my first 2 were in philosophy, which seems a little bit of a strange path to go from philosophy to analytics and statistics. But the way that I kind of got from point A to point B was that I actually focused my work in philosophy on artificial intelligence and consciousness. So,
Mhm.
what qualifies as being conscious? So, ChatGPT, think about that, for example. Would you consider that conscious or not? It's trained on a lot of data that it's basically piecing together, it's learning from. But in and of itself, and it depends on your philosophical argument, and that's where I think it gets really interesting. Is you can debate these things in a circle almost, which would probably be bad philosophy. But that being said, there's different arguments. But I think my studies were very much focused on what qualifies something as being conscious, having like, a background studying like Turing test and things like that. And then you have, some concepts, David Chalmers and like philosophical zombies, and something looks conscious, but do we want to say that the actions themselves are the thing that makes it conscious, or is it, what we would call like critical thinking? So I think that sort of work was really interesting. And also, I think in terms of analytics, it teaches you to think, think critically. And so you're able to approach complex problems. I think with the AI, it's been really interesting because you can take, the kind of business component as well as the technical component and, combine these things quite easily. And so I think with, ML and AI, like Python, I taught myself on the job, but it derived from the fact that, I already understood like philosophical logic, which led easily to understanding programming languages. But I think with AI and ML, it's been really interesting having that context because as you're going through these things, you're more aware of what you need to tell the model to do versus what you can, like you have that ability to understand the difference between, kind of what you need to give the model to perform versus what you yourself need to do and be on the lookout for.
So when I was in undergrad, I did pure mathematics,
Mhm.
and I had a research professor at school that I was very close with. It was actually taking classes with her that convinced me that I should switch my major halfway through into math, which required me to play some catch up. And she initially tried talking me out of it. And we came to an arrangement and became close friends after that. I still email back and forth with her. But I remember by the time I had gotten to be a senior, I had actually kind of done the catch up that was necessary and had like some credits available. So I would like do directed study with this professor and she would kind of teach me all these fun things. So we're sitting there and I'm kind of taking my like one-on-one class with her. And another professor that had an office right nearby who was a philosophy professor would come in and we would talk. We got to bandy back and forth about which kind of school of thought had a better handle on how to have logical arguments. And I think the big thing that it always came back to for me was the rules of logic are the rules of logic, right? They're kind
Mhm.
of non-negotiable. You make like a little table and it's like, well, there you go. The thing that's interesting about philosophy to me, and I promise that I'm going to transition this back to data and AI briefly, but the thing that was always interesting to me about philosophy was when you're having conversations
Mhm.
and debates in philosophy, it's almost never actually about the logic. It's
Mhm.
disagreement about the axioms.
Mhm.
So for me, right, like the idea is just like in math, it's like, okay, well, we define this, and then
Mhm.
the journey is from there, right? Like trying to do like unbelievably difficult logic problems. But in
Mhm.
philosophy, it's like all it takes is like one undergrad to come in and be like, well, what about this? And like we're changing the
Yeah.
axioms, and, like entire castles just crumble, we're like building whole new schools of thought. So I think the thing that is of interest to me as we
Mhm.
we talk about this is to know, is there a definition of what consciousness is for humanity or for AI, or are we still all arguing about that?
It depends. I think, we're all pretty much still arguing about that, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
I think with ChatGPT coming along, for example, and saying, our new model is going to perform at the level of like a PhD candidate. Well,
Mm,
yeah, because you trained it off of, material that is at that level. And so I think, a lot of this is still up for debate. I think, is learning, because then you come into philosophical biases where you can say, well, it's not necessarily producing or thinking through these problems themselves. It's been given training data and is taking that data and basically reformatting it, applying it to different use cases and spitting it back out.
mm,
But then there's some school of thoughts that would say, well, that's a bias because you expect you know this technology to function in a way that a human mind would function. Hence, you have that bias coming into play. So I think, it's still up for debate. I think it's more just the very interesting thing is as, the AI is going to take all of our jobs. It'll make you more productive. Like, it's probably, it can do a lot and you can use it to further your own career and you can use it to make yourself better at what you do. And it could be additive. And of course, in the future, and we already see this, that there are a lot of use cases that it may, replace some positions and replace some tasks, but it's also learning how to utilize it, learning how to harness it and kind of growing with it.
mm,
But I think the big thing is I see and I hear a lot this fear of it's going to take my job. And you can use it to make yourself better. And I think all that boils back to this idea of it's conscious. It's, going to basically do exactly what I do. You have like no code solutions now. You have all of these different technological capabilities. Just use it to make yourself better and more
mm.
efficient. So,
This is actually, I think, a big fulcrum, maybe is the right word, um, that a lot of this conversation levers around. My general take is that, as with anything that captures the public's imagination,
mhm,
um, humans are, I don't know if we actually know how to do anything except overcorrect. It's just, I think it's like one of those things where like hopefully there's like a dampening effect of like we just get frustrated and move on to the next thing and like eventually things settle down where they belong. But like we're just and I think there's the number of people that I hear speaking authoritatively
Hmm.
about the future.
Hmm.
I mean, that's always high, right? Like the penalty for being wrong in the court of public opinion is typically very low. Like they've just forgotten about it. But like if you just spouted something off and you were right, you can point back to it. Well, now you're like the oracle, you know? So I think there's a premium on being a hot take artist.
Yeah.
And I compare what I hear people saying out there, um, with at least like a surface level assessment of what I can detect to be like their level of like actual technical understanding of the way that
Mhm.
any of this stuff functions. And they do seem to be inversely proported. Like it seems like the people who are most open-minded and like curious and like like yeah, this could go a lot of different directions, like here are some things to be on the watch for, like they seem to be the people that like actually know what a transformer is.
Mhm.
And then, the people that are just like spouting off this month's latest buzzword as if like something new has happened, like they
Yeah.
tend to be very sure. I think relating to your last point, I think that, don't get me wrong,
Mhm.
what LLMs are capable, currently
It's
of
amazing.
achieving
Yeah.
is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And I think that it has, at least to me, a little bit less to do. Like, obviously, like the vector space transformer stuff is again like mind blowing, right? Like,
Mm.
and how it somehow works where you can do like vector addition and subtraction and do it like all sorts of like really, really cool stuff
Yeah.
that makes me like question the fundamental fabric of language and human understanding. But for me, the thing that's really cool is just like, holy cow, neural net scale.
Mhm.
Like, if we can just somehow pay the, the absurd amount of like time, energy, and computational cost to like train these absolutely massive neural nets,
Mhm.
it does seem to track to me that like if we were to make one with as many nodes as a
Yeah.
human brain, that we would start getting pretty
Yes.
similar function.
Yeah.
Um, but I think the flip side of that is a lot of the tests that we're giving it are tests that are pretty closely aligned with what it's designed to do. Like what
Yes.
you had mentioned, right? So like people are like, oh, well, they passed a law, it passed the bar. And it's like, okay, well, cool. Very hard to do. Like, well,
Yeah.
one of my best friends is studying for the bar right now, and it's a bear.
Mhm.
But I also think, okay, well, this is exactly the type of task that this tool is good at.
Yeah.
Taking gigantic swaths of like agreed upon public information
Yep.
and digesting it using the concepts of attention. And then what I want you to do is generate kind of like a middle of the road, can see the whole picture
Mhm.
distillation of what happened. Can
Yeah.
you describe what happened? These tools are incredible at that. And
Yeah.
same thing, like when you talk about early PhD candidate work,
Mhm.
right? Well, what is early PhD candidate work? It's okay,
Mhm.
well, we're going to do like a lot of describing of the current state of research in a particular subfield.
Mhm.
I think the more interesting test would be, can it create research and defend a thesis?
Yes.
Can
Yeah.
it do something new?
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that's as well to your point that if you had all the resources in the world, it could do more complex things, but would it do original things that it wasn't necessarily trained to do in the first place? And I think that is and I think that goes back to the consciousness question. Is it just repeating things that it's, already been told to do and piecing them together in different ways as requested, or is it coming up with something truly original? So I think that that is a really interesting point, and I think with all the resources in the world, and I think you go back to like what is functionally possible versus not. Maybe we would see, new combinations of things and maybe it would start learning. But unclear. And then yes, I think to your point, giving it a task which it wasn't necessarily, you know, set up to do because we're essentially setting these things up for success. So, I mean, which is a good thing because
Yeah.
it makes us more efficient, but
Yeah.
also, yeah, it's kind of a bias in and of itself coming into play.
As you were answering that, I realized that like there was a part of me that wanted to play devil's advocate on the other one, right? So I did not pursue a lot of academic philosophy, but I will say I went to a liberal arts school, so I was required to take a semester freshman year.
Mhm.
Um, let's just say that like maybe a freshman in college was slightly less mature than like a grown man, but I did really enjoy like throwing grenades into this room of ideas. So the grenade that it seems kind of obvious to throw right now is as I was talking about, the originality or the capability to do like real original thinking, it dawns on me that it's like, well, how much of that do we really do?
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
yeah, like if I think about it, the people that we hold up to be these like, oh my gosh, unbelievable, like Nobel level thinkers.
Mhm.
I mean, what percentage of their ideas was not just like stumbling on something or saying, take pattern from field X and apply it to field Y?
And I think you do get into, you can get into a lot of depth here, but I think, that's a valid point where, you have people that stumble into it. Then you also have people who are coming up with, original, very creative ideas. But I think even for those people who stumble into it and see those patterns, they're patterns, and I think it depends on the research. There's a lot of caveats. It depends on the research, but also
Mm,
I think you're seeing them piece together potentially if you had the model do the same thing, I think to a certain extent it could get there. But also, like research and furthering, kind of, medical applications and things like that, it can get there. It can see those patterns. We were able to determine, for example, the model we did recently, that it actually had another use case and it was completely an accident. But basically it started aggregating different organizations based off of their own buying patterns. And for us, that wasn't what we were trying to do. We're trying to do something totally different. So you
yeah.
can stumble on these things, but I think it's also piecing together, going back to the context, piecing together the context, which, machine learning, AI, all of these wonderful technologies may be able to do that to a certain degree. But then I think this goes back, and being the philosopher, I will debate myself. But it goes back.
It doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. Yeah.
It doesn't. You're taught to be objective. So,
Or
no
at
opinion.
least attempt, right? We're going to like operate under the premise we're being objective, right?
We're objective. We're very
I'm
objective.
sorry. The old argument with the math and the philosophy professors is coming back to me. I should be more dialed back.
But no, I think there it gets to the point, is context, right? So it gets to the point where it's making its own decision. Like,
Mm,
is it finding new things, new patterns, that we wouldn't expect it to find based off of what it was trained to do, as well as the fact that something that we think is not new and original necessarily. So is it
yeah,
something based off of the material it already had access to, something we would expect it to understand, or based off the material it had access to, is it over and above what we would expect it to understand? So, like, there's a lot there, and there's a lot of depth I think you can go into in these things. But I also think that there's a part of it where it's basically, there is a element of these people are, finding new discoveries, maybe based on accident, maybe based on um you know work that's already been done, maybe based off of, work they were doing and they found something new, but they're able to piece together why it's important and the context behind it.
that is it. That's it for me. I was actually just noodling towards the same area. And that's like, what I was doing is I was actually imagining, okay, cool. So let's take the realm of academia and talk about that. And to be very clear, I want to make sure that I say on the podcast, if the only thing that we're able to do is to stumble into new ideas or to take a recognized pattern that was stumbled into here and extend
Mhm.
that to other areas, that's an incredible achievement.
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Like just like the Socratic or scientific method repeatedly applied over long periods of time is enough for me,
Mhm.
right? Like the
Yeah.
idea that we actually have to be capable of like pure generative creation.
Yeah.
I don't know that I actually care a ton about that. And I
Yeah.
also, as I mentioned, I'm not entirely sure that we do that. We just may, hide our process or not understand our process well enough. But
Yeah.
I think about, like that the PhD, like let's say like a grad professor that's doing research running a lab. Whenever you talk to one of these people and you say like, okay, so what do you do for your research? Like, first off, there's like giddiness that anybody cares. And then and then second off, right, they're wait, you want to read my paper? And and then like you immediately get like they almost all say the same thing, right? Like, well, I'm really interested in blah, right?
Yeah.
Whatever, you know, I met a PhD that was a PhD in multidimensional tic-tac-toe. He was actually a really cool guy. I could have talked to him all afternoon. Um, but what they get really good at
Mhm.
is having a handle on what the current expectations are
Yeah.
and then detecting anything that deviates from them.
Yeah,
Right? So,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
they get, like, a really good, like, nose for anything out of the ordinary. And
Mhm.
as they're sifting through and looking at stuff, they'll see something and be like, this is, famous words of the research prof. Oh, that's interesting. And you're like, oh, so this is unexpected. We're going to do research on this. We want to figure
Yeah.
out why does this anomaly exist? And so I think that actually is a really good point that you made, where it's like it's the ability as you're going through to like shift attention across whatever the current context is,
Yeah.
but to still have this background context of like, here's what's normal. And if I see anything that appears to be an anomaly, well, now my focus gets heavy on that and we dig in. And
Yeah.
that is something that I haven't seen, that kind of like front burner, back burner idea.
Yeah. But I think even that same idea within the context of just, analytics within an organization is
Mm,
understanding kind of what's different, what's unknown, what's unique. And so I think, even going through day to day, my recent role, I started last year and just onboarding, it was interesting to say, like every time you go into a new organization, you level set and say, what is known, what is unknown, what would
yeah.
be additive, like what's creative, what's not creative. And so I think that's, kind of the same sort of idea of like, if you're, creating just, dashboards, there's nothing wrong with doing that. You do need reporting, but reporting has its, place in an organization. And it's not necessarily going to give you something without, any sort of human intervention that's above and beyond just numbers. And so I
Yeah.
think it's that same idea where you have that context coming into play of what's new, what is something that's creative, what's something that is in addition to what we already knew, and how do we piece this information to make it something that's actionable.
Yeah. There's no silver bullet in analytics for impact. There just isn't. And I think everybody thinks that it's Gen AI or something, like they think, oh, well, oh, it's agentic AI, right? And I'm kind of like, all right, well, all right, like, oh, well, it's going to be able to detect anomalies and let me know. And it's like, okay.
What are you going to do with that?
Yeah. Well, also, like, I think about it this way, right? So I've been doing analytics focused primarily on company performance and helping companies improve performance
Mhm.
for over a decade. And that does not count like any of the background stuff, right? Like in education and math or any of that other stuff. It is still unbelievably bespoke. And what I mean by that is, let's say that we talk about uh just like simple benchmarks for like industry standard metrics,
Mhm.
right? And I say, okay, well, revenue per FTE
Yeah.
or gross margin. I mean, you could say, oh, well, within an industry, it should be somewhere between, 10 and 30%. You're like, okay. So I think
Yeah.
having the ability to have, and this kind of, I guess, brings it full circle back to what we were talking about at the beginning, the ability to have a deep and meaningful, specific context
Mhm.
to where you are and to the situation that whatever you're looking at fits in is
Yeah.
something that I'm not even sure most humans have a good handle on right now. And as you said, like that really like coming in, learning in a new organization, that's really where the rubber meets the road. And whether, AGI eventually gets us to the place where it's doing it or we're learning how to do it, I would agree with you. I mean, even if you put those dashboards out there, it requires somebody that cares and that has the frame of reference of what was this number yesterday to
Mhm.
go in there and look at it and say, that's interesting, and
Yeah.
like dig into a problem.
Exactly, exactly. It's the context, and yeah, I think like even with AI we're seeing or like just different tools really. Like I don't want to say it's all AI, but like even different tools that we're seeing. We're seeing the ability to create dashboards and then you have, it generate context about, but it's never anything that's like an insight. And I think that's
Yeah.
the big thing too of like what counts is because we always hear we want insights and it's a nice thought, but what counts as an insight? What counts as an insight
Mm,
for your organization? When do you get from something that's an observation to analysis to actually something that's like an insight? And I think that varies by organization. And I think as well, like that's kind of what you get into is like the degrees to which you expect something and like what's your threshold for something being, whatever you want it to be, an insight, consciousness, whatever. So I think
yeah.
there's just a lot of variability.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely love this topic. I will say on a surface level, just from like having been out in industry for a long
Mhm.
time, I think there are two big concepts that will be massive steps forward for most organizations compared to like the level of maturity, even at like very, very large, complicated organizations that are capable of kind of doing a really good job with stuff. First off is a concept that, we in the field called like fair metrics. So, for example, like that example I gave before, how much revenue did we make each month? Like this
Mhm.
is the report, right? Kind of
Mhm.
like top level company performance by month. That's actually a really bad analysis. How many days are in each month?
Mhm.
It depends on which month you're in. Okay, so let's say it's not a leap year. There's 28 days in February. There's 31 days on the month on either side. That's a 3-day difference,
Mhm.
roughly corresponding to 10% different amount of time. Do we
Mhm.
think 10% is statistically significant? So when you see a 6% drop in February, it's like, oh, well, what went wrong in February? It's like nothing. We actually outperformed. We had 10% less days and only went down by 6%. Like the insight
Mhm.
goes in the opposite direction. What about, is there seasonality involved? Like just like
Yeah.
the idea of like baking as much context into the metric and like typically looking at a standard sum, not so great. Like there usually should be some sort of division, like not just revenue, but revenue per business day or revenue per FTE or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
The other big thing that I've found is statistics is a very mature field.
Mhm.
We have actual definitions of what is considered significant.
Yep.
There are, again, like standard definitions of what is considered an anomaly or an outlier. And there are, whether you're using like Python or Power BI or some other tool that's out there, there are ways to run like really, really simple, like, hey, find me all of the outliers on this metric across time. Find me all of the things that have no outliers and are totally steady, or run regressions. And, there is this toolkit of basic statistical tools that take a lot of guesswork out. And I've
Mhm.
noticed a lot of teams reinventing the wheel. And it's like, that part's a plug and play, guys.
Yeah. It can get pretty dangerous. Well, and I think the big thing that, like, in teaching, I'm trying to get my students more and this is a thing that I was that I've been trying to do for some time, is bake even if it's, more analytically focused, more, kind of broader stats for advertising, just statistics as a whole and bridging
Mhm.
that gap between, you know, doing something in a classroom versus, having an actual real world application. Because I think that's where, we have stats coursework that we go through. We have, you know, some degree of either Python or some other tool that they're learning. You know, they get the choice because we try to be a little bit flexible in that. But that being said, they get a choice in tools, but there's the assumption that when they leave, they'll be able to connect statistics with something that is a real world application, something to show for it, like some, you know, project that they've had to complete by the time they leave. Just because a big thing that we are seeing too is that a lot of these folks are coming into the field, and, you know, they'll either have, you know, an academic familiarity with, you know, some of the larger statistical concepts and able to apply it, but apply it incorrectly, or they will not, you know, be very comfortable with it and kind of fly by what they can and go into the field and really not have a handle on any of these things, and they'd be expected to know, you know, some sort of, you know, basic level at least, for statistical analysis if they're dealing with like a lot of data. And
Mm.
so I think that's something else that we've seen be a little both interesting and dangerous, and that we've tried to address in terms of some of the coursework through teaching, is just basically you need to understand how to tie statistical concepts and understand what those statistical concepts are to real world applications.
So I think we've touched on a couple things, but I want to make sure that I ask you point blank, what is really hard in the field right now? And what are you and seeing others do to meet the challenge?
So I think there's two big things. I think one of them is and they're kind of related, that everything is moving so quickly. And
Mm,
so I think you both get, you know, folks that are actually, you know, doing the analytics and, you know, trying to keep their skills up, seeing all of this and not knowing necessarily what to tackle because there's just so much to tackle. So
yeah.
you almost feel like you have to go broad but also be specialized, and that's impossible. There's only so many hours in a day. So that being said, I think, you know, it's trying to guide, you know, either your employees or, you know, kind of the organization, and where are we focusing? We could be, you know, and I think that goes back to, you don't have an infinite back to the machine learning idea. You don't have an infinite amount of resources.
Mm,
Um, and so in order to ensure you're being productive with the resources you have in this, like whatever investment your organization can make. If you're Amazon, great. You can probably do everything pretty well. And you do everything quite well. But if you're not, then you may have limitations. So it's how do you scale and what do you invest in? So I think, you know, and how do you train your people? So also, you know, what areas do you need to cover, and how do you boil that down to how that translates into developing skills on your team and within your organization. And so from my perspective at least, you know, I think machine learning helps us scale. It helps us find trends that otherwise would take a long time to find, but it's also ensuring that people still have those analytical capabilities and are close to the business, understand changes in the business, and don't lose sight of that for just the technology. I think the other part of it is because things are growing so fast, you have some roles that could do multiple things that aren't necessarily clearly defined. And so I think it's trying to educate organizations to understand kind of what counts as statistical analysis, what counts as something that's like more IT, what counts as something that should belong with the business, what's something that's purely finance. Because I think with a lot of the new technology and a lot of new tools, all of these kind of roles have a lot of ways they can go,
mm,
and there's more, you know, kind of I think you can, like, especially with, you know, the chat GPTs of the world, and you have Looker and all these, you know, tools that just make things very easy to do. A lot of people can do things that used to require a specialized skill set,
mm.
but it's understanding when you need that specialized skill set versus when, you know, you can, you know, just use the tools yourself. So I think it's educating the organization too, and, you know, kind of where the industry is going, what you need to do to keep up with it, what you need to do to train and, you know, kind of maintain talent, as well as the fact that you need to educate on like what roles and specialties are, and like what kind of specialized knowledge is needed within the organization to do which functions.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't heard it ever worded that clearly. Um, but yeah, that is such a clear assessment of something that I see in the landscape. And obviously, this is one that's a little bit close to my heart as a consultant that goes out there and is trying to convince people like, here's why you need someone like me. Like, here's
Mhm.
why I have a place in the market that is not just like exploitative, right? Like, here's the actual value that somebody like me brings to the table. Um, it can be very easy to just like take somebody that's like light on tech skill or bandwidth and be like, oh, you need me, like, and you see a lot of consultants that do this, right? They'll just like plop somebody in your company and will try to live there quietly for as long as possible. And it's like I try to do the opposite of that and try to be like very, very focused, like, here's where I can bring value, and then let's get this onto your own team, like that's better for your business.
Mhm.
I generally find that the only way to be able to do that, the only way to actually figure that stuff out
Mhm.
is to circle back to a little bit of a trope within our space, is to get like very, very clear on what the business use case is.
Mhm.
Again, full circle, like what are the decisions that are most important for us to make that have a high penalty for being wrong that we
Yeah.
need to make sure that we do right? And what are the pieces of the puzzle to make sure that we can do that? Not just for this, like, hey, here are the three decisions that are on my plate right now, but for we know that these classes of decisions are going to be evergreen problems for us. How do we build infrastructure that allows us to make those one-way decisions really, really effectively going forward? And what skill sets do we need?
Yeah, that makes
Um,
sense.
yeah, so I couldn't agree more. Stephanie, I had to resist the urge to just clear my schedule for the afternoon to talk about the philosophy of AI consciousness with you. I could definitely debate that and chat and learn from you all day. So I personally have found this conversation unbelievably mentally stimulating. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to go back and think a little bit about the days of logic, the days where things were pure for me. I live in the messy dirty business world now. So that was a really fun opportunity. I can't thank you enough for coming on and sharing your time with me and the listeners, but also for going out and learning about something really interesting and fun to talk about. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on. It's been really interesting and definitely have learned a lot as well. So it's been a good chat and thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to make sure that before we go, we give the listeners a chance to get to know you a little bit better. So tell me a little bit outside of all of this stuff about you.
Yeah, so I am a very relatively boring person. I like I teach. I teach a lot. I garden, I run. I started. I originally went to school for opera, so I enjoy going. Seeing shows and classical music performances and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I'm very much the analytics nerd that I am, but
Yeah.
yeah, and I live in the DC area and have been here for since 2015. Came here after grad school and just stayed. Really love it. So yeah, yeah, mostly just run, hike, garden, teach, read.
I would say that opera, at least, I can't claim to be exceptionally cultured in the world of opera, but what little opera I have exposure to strikes me as the opposite of boring. It is like very big and very loud and very, like costumes and, loud singing and all that stuff. So it's definitely a high level of stimulus. Now, if anybody wants to learn a little bit more about what you're doing or what you're working on or anything that you're currently doing research or teaching wise or at work, what are the best ways to reach out, connect, learn a little bit more and follow what you're doing?
Yeah, you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find. I'm under my name. But so LinkedIn's probably the best place to find me. I have an email as well, but I don't check it as frequently because it's personal email. But feel free to reach out to me at Stephanie Page, Page, 2014 at outlook.com. It's a long one. But that being said, LinkedIn's probably the best way to reach me.
Okay, awesome. Stephanie, like I said, I could have done this all day. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I also want to make sure to thank our listeners. You guys are really why we get the opportunity to do this and why I get to have so many fun conversations. So, thank you for continuing to pay attention and making this podcast a reality. If you liked what you heard today, please make sure to show this podcast to a friend, let them know, share it someplace, give us a like or a review, hopefully, a really good 5-star review. Those are the best kind of reviews. But I want to thank you guys for listening, and all of that feedback definitely helps. Stephanie, thanks again. This has been another exciting episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Have a great day. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.